That's like really. So in recognition of the bells next door, we'll call this meeting to order. It is 6:02 roughly.
Be back.
Start with the member roll call. James Oku.
Here.
Natalie Sayre is unable to attend tonight. I am here, John Barge. Peter Markey.
Here.
Ryan Casey.
Here.
Cole Masa Villegas
Anastasia here.
Anastasia. Crystal Shea.
Here.
And I guess Daniel is going to join us shortly. Jim Howard, I haven't seen him for a while. San Mateo County Agriculture Commissioner Corin Little.
Here.
Farm Bureau Executive Director Jess Brown.
Here.
And UC Co-op Extension Representative Igor Lacan is not here today. And San Mateo County Planning Liaison Olivia Gould. Then agenda item number 3, oral communications allows the public to address the committee on any matter not on the agenda. If your subject is not on the agenda, the chair will recognize you at this time. Speakers customarily are limited to 3 minutes. See instructions explained at the end of the agenda regarding instruction for public. Have any hands up?
Not at this time.
Anybody in our esteemed audience? Right, and then do we have minutes? Item number 4 is consideration of meeting minutes from July 8th, 2024. And I did not review them. Did we have some other folks get a chance to review those? Gosh, well, thank you for preparing them.
We can carry it over.
We could carry it over, and I encourage everybody to read through them before the meeting next week, next month, rather. Okay, and then number 5, committee member updates and or questions to allow committee members to share news and reports concerns for items not on the agenda. And just a reminder, we're not supposed to really have discussions about these items if they're not on the agenda, but James?
I just wanted to give an update that Sun Valley Floral closed, and they were one of the largest cut flower producers in the country, I believe. They closed both the locations, and one in Arcata and the other in Oxnard. And I heard that they laid off like 300 to 600 people. So, sad news for Ed.
So they were based both in the north and the south.
Yeah, they were a huge cut flower producer. They did a lot of the tulips that you see in grocery stores and very large lily program too.
I have data.
Yes, Glenn, please.
On Friday, I sent out a letter to all of our off-ID and restricted material permit holders about a US EPA has suspended dactyl. It's a pre-emergent herbicide, and so basically there can be no use, no selling of it, no holding for sale of it past August 6th. So that passed. So we don't really have much use of it in San Mateo County, but because it happened quickly, I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of it. So a letter is going out, and it's also going out to our dealers too in the county as well, to make sure that no one uses it or sells it. It's under evaluation, but they're basically keeping a hold on it until that evaluation is completed. So likely it will come back into use ever. So that's kind of been the trend of pesticides that are suspended. As far as high path avian influenza, California has met all the necessary actions and surveillance requirements to declare us free of high path avian influenza. So pretty much because our poultry industry was hit by it pretty hard last year, so we're now free of it. And then I am going to be presenting the crop report on August 27th to the Board of Supervisors.
The pesticide was suspended.
It was due to some health concerns that they were seeing. Many years ago, I'm not quite sure how many, but it was suspended for all use in sod use. And then it was still allowed in some of the crops, but it's due to health issues. Yeah, yeah.
And sorry, Corin, what was the date again for the presentation to the board?
August 27th.
Thank you. I did have just one item. It's actually regarding the agenda because it's going to be upcoming. For items 6 and 7, I'm actually going to reverse the order of those. So we're going to have the presentation for the Farm Labor Task Force first, and then we're going to have the Environmental Health Services is going to follow.
Yeah, I guess I have something related to the Farm Worker Commission. I had made an announcement that maybe somebody else from the committee would need to step in, but I feel like that hasn't really been resolved because there's the possibility of me continuing on that commission. We I don't know what you call it, but renewing the participation in that. But if there are some committee members here that really would like to participate, I've been on this committee for a long time, so I'm starting to wonder, like, is it time to maybe step away from here as well? And then my role representing the AIC at that commission would no longer be, appropriate. So just maybe something to think about for folks.
And I'm also checking on, I was trying to read through all the regulations to check on that for you,
Yeah.
just to verify.
But yeah, I had a 1-year appointment to that other commission. So if there is somebody who is like to dedicate, it's only every other month. The meetings are very well organized. Anybody else from the committee? Bring up? All right, well then we're excited to welcome Justin Mates, Deputy County Executive, to provide a farm worker task force update.
Good evening. I think I've met most of you separately, but I think this might be my first time presenting to this body, so thank you for having me here tonight. I'm here to give an update on the work of the Farm Labor Housing Compliance Task Force. I see a lot of familiar faces, including some who may have seen a very similar presentation I gave last month at the Farm Worker Advisory Commission. So I might skip some of the background issues and get to what I think you probably are all a little bit more interested in. Real quick, we've got many staff here from multiple presentations, but in terms of the task force, we have multiple departments represented here tonight, including, of course, our Ag Commissioner, Corin Whittle. We have Blake Smith from Environmental Health Services, Heather Forshee from Environmental Health Services, Steve Monowitz from Planning and Building, and Jennifer Cunha from our office. You may recognize Jennifer. She's worked for the city of Half Moon Bay. She works for the county executive's office now. All of us working on various aspects of the task force. Oh, thank you. Please go ahead and go to the first slide. Brief overview of our agenda tonight. I'll try to keep it compact. We need plenty of time for questions and discussion. Next slide, please. I think you're all pretty familiar with the background and why the task force was created in the wake of the Half Moon Bay shooting. And our goal was to inspect all employee housing on agricultural land in the unincorporated county of San Mateo. We were for minimum habitability standards. These are things like potable water, basic fire safety, basic plumbing and heating, and waste disposal. This is not inspections for current code standards. It's not inspections to determine whether or not structures were built legally. It's really about these minimum habitability standards. We are also focusing on the unincorporated area. Our jurisdiction within cities, specifically the city of Half Moon Bay, is more limited. So the task force is not inspecting agricultural operations within the city limits. However, the city is conducting its own inspections. We have shared with the city our procedures and methods for doing these inspections, and they have started their own inspections, and those are ongoing. Next slide, please. You probably can't see this really well, but the first goal of the task force is just to understand where the current agricultural operations are in the county. You all in this room may have a better idea of it than we do, but just being an ag or ranch operation is not something that is regulated by the county. So part of the first task is just to understand what all the active operations were in the county. We will be publishing a final report that has this map, so you don't have to study it now, but just to give a sense of the spread of where we identified what we believe were active ag operations. And from that list, we then evaluate each to determine if any were providing employee housing in the unincorporated county. Next slide, please. The task force is nearing the end of its work. We have about 14 properties left of about roughly 120 operations. Now, some operations are, as you know, spread across multiple properties. Some properties have multiple operations. So, you know, I use the term properties and operations somewhat interchangeably, but we were in the universe of 120 active operations and identifying which had employee housing. I see Greg going to correct me.
No, I'm not going to correct you. I just want to clarify. 172 units, you mean housing units, not farms or facilities,
Exactly.
but housing units.
Yes, and we're going to get to that. Thank you very much. It is 172 units that we've identified and evaluated. Not all of them proved to have current ag employees. So of that 172 units, 130 have been identified as housing farm workers who are employed and work on the farm where the housing is, or their land where the housing is. And in those units, we've identified 347 farm workers. Now, units, as Greg has identified, it's our tracking purposes. Unit can be multiple things. You'll see in later slides. It's not necessarily one room. It could be a whole house. Could be just one room. We depended on the situation how we tracked what a unit was.
Does the 347 account for non-farm worker family members?
No. No. So that's 346. Some of those will be households, and some of those may be individuals.
So the larger, the 130 units served a larger population than just the 347.
Yes. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about what we found so far. Next slide, please. So of the operations that we've evaluated, 55 of them so far have been identified to house at least one farm worker. 38% are the 5 or more farm workers, and that's an important distinction. As you may know, if you're an operation that houses 5 or more farm workers, you come under the state's Employee Housing Act. You're required to get a permit from our local environmental health department, and you're subject to certain standards, including annual inspections. We have about 40% of our operators in that category, and today we've identified 62%, which are in the smaller, in terms of housing, at least smaller operations of 1 to 4 farm workers. One of the things that the task force identified was we identified 5 operators who had 5 or more farm workers, but housing 5 or more farm workers, but were not registered under the state program administered by environmental health. And so those 5 operators are now in the process of going through the process of getting registered with the permit program, and they will then be subject to the annual inspections of the permit program. Next slide, please. So this is to give you a sense of the spread of types of units. So each of these is what we're tracking as a unit, but they varied. The vast majority were manufactured mobile homes and single-family homes, but there were other types of units that were identified. I'll be frank, a little bit less of the sort of other kind of variety than we were expecting. We saw a majority as manufactured homes. We didn't see a lot of a whole bunch of other alternative types of housing, but there were some, as this slide reflects. Next slide, please. For what we found for compliance with these minimum habitability standards, what we found is the majority, over 60% of the units did comply with minimum habitability standards. They did have all those basic conditions of safe and healthy housing that we talked about earlier. That being said, of the 130 units, as this slide shows, actually 49 required some sort of corrective action. So that's the 48 that had corrective action that was the sort that was, a certain time frame, let's say 90 days, and we given to provide whatever corrections. And the corrections were sometimes simple. No fire alarms, for example, or smoke detectors, I should say, were in the building. Others a little bit more significant. Could have been issues with the septic system, could have been issues with the water system. All of those are in that 48. There was also one yellow tag of a farm worker unit. When I gave this presentation last month, we didn't have any of those in a farm worker unit, but now since that presentation, there has been a yellow tag, essentially that the housing was unsafe, and that the farm worker family should not be living in that and spending the night in that, but some access was allowed for doing corrections and gathering items. That's the difference between a yellow tag and a red tag. Red tag is basically no admittance at all. That family was not displaced. The operator or the landowner accommodated that family in another unit on the property. But those are the stats in terms of the corrections. As you'll see from this slide, the key issues, the most common issues, probably surprise to no one in this room, water and septic on the coast can be difficult. Those are the most common compliance issues that we identified, as well as just the lack of smoke detectors, which are a simple but really important fire safety component of housing. When we did find items to correct, like sort of discussed earlier, operators were given a set time frame by which to make those corrections. Our inspectors and our staff tried to be accommodating as possible, setting reasonable timeframes based on the risk of the condition, as well as the time it would take to correct those conditions. And then our team is following up to ensure that operators and owners are making those required corrections. Next slide, please. So this slide provides a little more detail in terms of the types of corrections. Some units may have had multiple corrections needed, so the numbers may not add up perfectly, but these are the types of issues that were found. As you can see, water supply issues were the most common issue identified, and water supply really meant the water was not within safe drinking standards. Each of those operators were identified to have those issues. our environmental health folks worked with them to identify what corrections were needed to bring their water within safe drinking standards. Those corrections are all in the process of being made or have been made. So all of the properties we identified with this issue will have this issue corrected. However, it was a common issue. Septic system was another issue, and that could range to all sorts of things, but a lot of what we found was either there were no septic systems happening or operating on the property. Some of those just had above ground storage tanks for the waste disposal, or there might have been need for infrastructure improvements. That was another very common, I say structural issue. The smoke detection, as you can see, was very common, but an easy fix. Next slide, please. So what are we going from here? If you all were in some of those operator meetings that we had last year, we talked about this being the first step of the process and really understanding where our housing stock was for farm workers on the farms, and then having a discussion about what comes next. What can we do about it as a community moving forward? So what I'm going to present now is a series of proposals that the task force has come up with. The point of the meeting we had at the Farm Worker Advisory Commission last month, and the meeting we're having tonight, and the meetings we'll have in the next few weeks with PMAC, with the Farm Bureau, with some of farm worker convenings, is to get community feedback and input on the following proposals. Many of these will require Board of Supervisors approval. We've not presented these to the Board of Supervisors yet. We've not gotten that approval. This is the process of getting the input on these proposals about what we do going forward based on what the task force found. Next slide, please. The first is really the most common issue we found, which was the safe drinking water. Obviously, a fundamental component of anyone's home. And although through the task force's work, all of the identified issues have been addressed in the short run, there seems to be a need to be able to identify if and when water falls below safe drinking standards on these properties again. And so what we'll be proposing here is a new ordinance for any property that provides farm worker housing to be subjected to the kind of regular monitoring that larger systems are subjected to ensure that water remains within safe drinking standards. Next slide, please. Septic systems are a real challenge, as you all know. Most of the law and regulations in this area is not something that the county has the authority to change. They come from state law, and they're just enforced at the county level. And so, but one of the areas where we think we can do something locally is to try to reduce the minimum septic size requirements, hopefully addressing some of the physical limitations of installing legal septic systems in terms of setbacks and sufficient leach fields and the like. And so here we would be proposing to modify the minimum septic requirement from a 3-bedroom residence to a 1-bedroom. Again, it still has to reflect what's being built, but it's a different minimum. If only 1 bedroom is being built, that's what would that minimum would apply. And the second is to align farm worker units with how ADUs are treated in terms of the capacity sort of assigned or understood the required capacity for those additional units. So that would be another change to align farm worker units with ADUs. I'm going to run through these. I'm sure that you all have questions. I'll finish my presentation. We have people in the room much more knowledgeable about some of the technical aspects of these things, but we'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Next slide, please. We all know that the process to construct or renovate housing on the coast can be legally onerous, being in the coastal zone. So the proposal here we have would be to seek an amendment to our LCP to establish a coastal development permit exemption for farm labor housing projects, so long as they don't impact coastal resources as necessary to comply with the Coastal Act, which again is a state law that we don't have the authority to revise at the local level. So just trying to reduce the administrative and hurdles to constructing and rehabilitating farm worker housing. Next slide. We are looking to and already have implemented some process changes here. We, I think, are in the process or nearly finished with updating our farm labor housing guidebook, which we're hoping to be sort of the one-stop guide that anybody looking to construct or renovate farm labor housing would need to understand the permitting and the legal requirements around that process. We know we've gotten questions about trailers and RVs and when and how they can be used, so we are looking to try to update and clarify our guidance around those types of structures. We have also added dedicated staffing to both planning and building and environmental health, who are on the approval and review side of things to help expedite as best we can that review process for those looking to, again, either construct new septic or water systems and farm labor housing or renovate. And then finally, we did get some questions from operators about understanding what resources may be available to comply with current building code, including electrification requirements. And so we'd also be looking to assemble the best we can the resources that could be available for operators who are looking to add farm labor housing. Next slide, please. We are also looking at, we've gotten many requests to refresh the farm labor housing loan program, which some of you may recall from recent years. It was a subsidized loan program for operators who were constructing or rehabilitating farm labor housing. All of the money put behind that program has been used now, but we've been asked to take a look at refreshing that program, and we'll be rolling that out and announcing the new program when those details become available. Next slide, please. Next slide, next steps. So we are, as I said, finishing up the task force inspections. We have finished the vast majority. We still have some left. We don't anticipate that the remaining properties are going to vastly change our findings or the sort of issues we're seeing out in the field. And so we have started with this community outreach now because we believe these are the changes that could help impact the quality and safety of farm labor housing in our community. So these are our recommendations, but the inspections are finishing up. When they are completed, we will be publishing a final report that has the final statistics. We are going to make that report available on a website that you probably already have seen, but I'll show you in a moment. We are meeting, last week we met with the Farm Worker Advisory Commission. We're meeting with you all tonight. We're going to hit PMAC, the Farm Bureau. We're going to also meet with the RCD, and we are having farm workers community-specific meetings as well in the next month and a half or so to gather input on these proposals. And then after that, we'll be implementing the proposals and seeking for approval on whatever comes out of this process. Next slide, please. This is the website. It has some few frequently asked questions. It will be where we publish the final report for the task force. Next slide, please. Want to just have this contact information and remind folks of contact information for where to report concerns about farm labor housing. Next slide. And just want to remind folks of some of the other initiatives going on right now with respect to farm labor housing. The task force scope is really focused on the farm labor housing provided on the farms, but there are of course other things going on. I'm happy to answer questions about these, but just wanted to highlight some of the other initiatives that the counties are taking or approving at this time. Next slide. And with that, we'd be happy to take any questions. Yes, please. Oh, actually, Sharon, I don't know how you want to do the question.
So I have 3 questions. The first question is, you're talking about some of the different types of housing. And I was wondering if there was going to be any recommendation to opening up new types of housing you would allow for farm labor, and specifically stuff like tiny homes. The second question I have was, you talk about the number of violations, and I was curious on what % of the violations came from people that had farm labor housing 5 or greater, and how many came from the ones that were 4 and under. Because the ones that are all 5 and under get inspected annually, right?
Right.
And then the last question I have was, you were talking about starting a program for people to report like their water system needs to you guys, right?
Monitoring, right, so not for tenants, but for property owners.
Yes.
Yep.
And so would that apply to larger operators that are already like public water systems that deal with state and are already involved with all this water reporting? Is this gonna be additional or is this gonna be separate? And I know a lot in the past, I've asked for county to take back the role of the public water stuff, because I know in the past, you guys used to deal with all of our public water and safety needs and reporting, and then eventually it went to state, and then that's become a nightmare. So I'm hoping that this system could take back some of what the state's doing.
So I'll answer those in reverse order, because I think you might have seen me smile when you asked the third question, not because it's funny, but because I saw clearly our folks in environmental health wanting to jump in and answer that question. Which is the answer I think I can get it, which is no, we're not expanding the program for the larger operators, which are already water systems. Those are already subject to regular monitoring. This would be an ordinance to add the smaller systems to be subject to that same sort of monitoring. So it would not be an additional overlay for the larger systems that are already subject to that kind of regulation. Okay, I did get that right. On the regulatory piece, I would hand that off to Heather.
Right, so you're talking about the LPA, it's a local promising agency where we handed off all of those water systems to the state. It would not be easy for us to take them back.
Please.
I am heartened that you want us to take them back, but there were a number of reasons why we did it, and the trend statewide is that the counties are giving these programs to the state to run for a number of reasons. And it frustrates me to know that they're not, the state isn't providing you the level of service that you need. And when that happens, we can certainly try to help liaise with you and them. And so I would just encourage you to reach out to Greg or the water program lead, and we can try to liaise.
Yeah, in order for me to get a response, I need to have lawyers write letters.
Are
at
you
this point.
serious?
Yeah, and even then, they might not respond for months at a time.
I'm really
And
sorry.
We're just trying to get like permitting through, we don't know where we are, et cetera, and it's a nightmare dealing with them.
So maybe
Talk to
Greg
me
can help
afterwards.
work with you and try to break down some of those communication barriers.
And then your last question was about tiny homes. I mean,
So maybe I can answer that because I've gone really deep into that.
I was gonna say,
And I
this
am
is
so
something we
deep
spent a
into
lot of
tiny
time on. Go
homes,
ahead.
right? So I went off-roading all over the place with tiny homes. And so one thing that we need to remember is that for 5 or more employees, meaning you fall under the state employee housing regs. 1 to 4 employees, you actually fall under federal Department of Labor requirements. And, I've done a bunch of digging and it boils down to square footage. So in the state regs, tiny homes are actually defined as a subcategory of an RV. And so it is, for all intents and purposes, a tiny home is an RV, that looks pretty, in an overly simplistic way. But the way the regs look at any employee housing is by square footage. And that is where, if you look at an RV or even a tiny home, you still have to have a minimum square footage of 50, I think it's 50 square feet. 50 square feet. And that applies all the way down, because we found a document where the feds compared the federal Department of Labor farm worker housing living standards or construction standards to the state's employee housing standards. And it's columns side by side, and the feds and the states are completely aligned. And so when we look at that 50 square footage or 50 square foot requirement for sleeping, it doesn't matter whether it's designed as a tiny home or an RV. That's where it's the challenge there is you can't have multiple people in an RV if you can't meet that minimum square footage. So I know that's an overly simplistic way of describing it, but it's 50 square
So
feet.
it is legal if you can meet the square footage.
It is, if you look at the regs, and we'll have to align, but I believe that tiny homes as defined are basically, they fall in the same category as RVs. And I'm looking to you because you want to jump in.
Oh, I'm happy to.
I think that last point about RVs and trailers, you know, RVs and trailers generally are not constructed to be used for permanent habitation. So our concerns about use of RVs and trailers is how they'll withstand the weather and time here on the coast. But we recognize that that's pretty affordable comparatively and easy way to install housing. So we're exploring ways in which we can allow that to occur in accordance with these minimum square footage, but with some sort of, you know, annual monitoring to make sure that they're maintained over time and don't become dilapidated and unsafe.
Yeah, and I think that the point there about tiny homes being an RV that looks nicer, it's actually an RV that actually is designed to last as well, so.
And
Some
there's
more
a
than others.
full, right, so there's a
Sure.
full range. Tiny homes, the industry is like, it's a very broad umbrella with different priorities. When I communicated with the state housing community development and talked about tiny homes, they kept pointing me back to RVs. This is, you know, it needs to basically be an RV. And there's specific language to employee housing with respect to RVs. Now, when we take it a step further and we start looking for broader community living options or alternatives, that's where we run into larger issues with state housing code and requirements therein. But as employee housing, RVs are specifically identified as an option for employee housing. And so we just, it's a needle we're trying to thread, but it isn't as straightforward as it would seem. I went down a rabbit hole with state HCD. I was also talking to the tiny home industry and association, and state HCD kept pointing back to, you need to meet certain requirements. You need to meet, you know, what is it called? The housing plan requirements. There are a bunch of things that diverge from employee housing, and all we can do right now is just look at employee housing from a federal Department of Labor standard perspective and from a state employee housing standard, and limit our review to that.
So, I know there's a lot of questions, we'll get to those, just a couple of points in this. Number one, we're talking about a future state of what's legal. To be clear, when the task force identified farm labor housing, someone living in a trailer or RV, or if there was a tiny home, that was not a citation or correction that was required. For the purpose of the task force, that was not something that needed to be corrected. I just wanted to clarify that. But in the future state of what will be illegally allowed to be constructed, this is what we're talking about now. The complexities of this is why we're trying to clarify this as best as we can in the guidance for you all, so you can understand what is allowable and what isn't. And it really is this balance of understanding the ease and efficiency of some tiny homes or alternative types of structures with understanding the needs of permanent dwellings. And we see this a lot, especially on Bayside mobile home parks, is that a lot of these RVs and trailers, they really degrade over time. They are built to be permanent dwellings, and that's what creates the unsafe condition over time. And so part of the consideration is, if this is going to be something that's used widely, how can we build in some sort of understanding they're not going to fall into an unsafe state, even if they started off safe. How do we make sure they're not going to fall into an unsafe state? I'm going to hand it over to Greg real quick to clarify anything, and then I know we've got questions all around.
Add on, you know, we talked about the yellow tag condition that we ran into and other problems, and in the safety inspection, much of the time when there was unsafe conditions that needed to be mitigated in some way, it was because somebody had taken an RV or trailer and added on to it. They considered it permanent. They attached structures to that. In some cases, fully encasing travel trailers within what became another building that they built around it, with an exit, ingress and egress became a big safety issue.
Right, and then you also see, you know, the addition of water heaters, you know, because the water heaters then
Right.
that are part of the RVs are not sufficient. And so we had to take a step back when I was doing this research and focus only on employee housing, because it's very clear what employee housing allows and doesn't allow for when we're looking at federal and state employee housing requirements. And so any talk beyond that, I think, is more of an existential future state, but what we can do is clarify what state HCD allows in employee housing. And these 1 to 4 that we talked about, which is I think 40%, 60%, US Department of Labor, very clear. It's completely aligned, and we've got that document. We can post that document. It's really straightforward, but we're assuming and expecting that anybody who's providing employee housing is going to make sure that they align with the.
So it's not the 1 to 4, you're saying that's jump on the 5 plus. The ones who are
The 1 to 4 is Federal Department of Labor
Oh, okay.
requirements, right? And so I wanted to know, because we don't look at that stuff. We have no idea what Federal Department of Labor requires, but we came across a document that basically lined them up side by side. And they are very closely aligned, and some of it is identical. And so we would just want to, we don't enforce Federal Department of Labor requirements, but we would just want to point out that there isn't really a deviation 1 to 4 versus 5 or more.
Right, and we say you're talking about environmental health. the
Right.
HARDA program. Right. And we have a bunch of hands to try to get an order that I saw people have.
Hi, James Inglesby, a member of the public and resident of Passman Bay in San Mateo County. First, thank you for doing this. This is really, really helpful. I haven't seen this presentation before. And just thank you for taking the time tonight to come out and explain it to us. And to the point, and also to James's point, if you could help by just picking out what kind of structures do work, do meet your requirements, that you can just give us some examples, maybe even on structured for different type of uses or just price points, whatever, because to James's point, trying to figure this out, if you're confused, all of us are confused,
Right.
and we've created this problem where we're all trying to stare at each other's belly buttons. If you could just please make it straightforward and give us examples. You don't have to support a particular company. Oh, I think these A-frames are the best thing ever, but give us some reference designs or something that we can actually know what's going to be approved, because trying to suss this out in advance is really difficult, and we want to make this easier. I think we can all agree on that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
I just, if I could respond real quickly, I mean, a unit that is certified by State Housing and Community Development as being built consistent with code, safety and code requirements, in my opinion, is something that you can rely on. Okay, the tiny home manufacturers are generally not certified by the state. But if you can get a unit with a state placard, generally they're called manufactured homes. But those that have been certified by the state as being built safely is definitely something you can rely on.
First, just want to say thank you all for coming out here. This is very helpful to go over all this information. And tiny home discussion, I think everybody's ears perked up when we heard that, because I think that's something we've talked about in this room. It's something I think I'm very interested in addressing. I know you guys know how serious of an issue housing is on the coast. I think we see it particularly pronounced in our area. Just, it's not uncommon for a lot of folks we know to have 4 families in one household. It's not uncommon for folks sleeping in their cars. It's not, I know a half dozen really young, promising farmers who have left this region in the last calendar year just because there's no housing out here. And so I think it's the tiny home, like potential resolution seems to be the most promising to me because it's fast. It's something that it seems relatively fast compared to just permitting and kind of going through the more laborious process. I know that's a different discussion in terms of how do we make permitting more efficient. So my question is, with this conversation with tiny homes currently, if somebody wanted to put in a tiny home tomorrow, what are the steps they take? What is step 1, step 2? How can they ensure that what they're doing is going to be fully permitted? What is the most efficient way of doing that? And the second question default is, if that's not clear cut currently, is there a time frame of when we can expect that to be very clear cut soon?
Right. So the short answer is if the tiny home has an HCD sticker on it, then it's treated the same way as an RV and under the state and federal regs for employee housing. As a mobile, as a
Manufactured.
right.
Not the RV.
Right. Well, RVs have insignia on them.
For, from the DMV for safe travel.
Right,
So for permanent habitation.
Right. for RVs, they are allowed in state and federal code for employee housing. Now, if you're looking at, so if you're looking at an RV, if you imagine an RV, you can, and you imagine how many square feet in an RV. I don't know how many people you can put in an RV. But I don't think it's more than one or two. And so that's gonna hit the wall on the regs and, you know, and so when we're looking at a family trying to fit into the employee housing standards, which is what we're trying to suss this out for employee housing, which is a separate issue than what you're problem, what you described is a much bigger issue. And we're trying to suss out for employee housing, how can we get there? But for families with, employees with families, it's gonna be hard, even with a square footage requirement, to fit in, fit this square peg into a round hole because of the square footage.
Taking a step back, just to the process in general, I've got staff that are ready and willing to help anyone who wants to install employee housing on their property. We look at site plans, the zoning district, what's there already. We sit down, we talk with you about what's options are available. We consult with environmental health about their requirements and relationship to the federal and state laws that Heather are mentioning. So I'd like to offer that service to all of you. If you're interested in building farm worker housing, please call me directly and I'll set you up with a planner and we'll walk you through the process and the options. So a lot of it might be case specific, every property is a little bit different. And so it's hard to generalize, but that's one of the reasons why the county executive has agreed to give us more resources, because we want to be there to help you navigate the process.
And you have a business card?
Yeah, sure did.
Yeah, thank you. My question, I've heard water and square footage, and the biggest hurdle is drilling wells, the 2.5. So it was drilled in years ago, you better find 2.5 gallons of water minimum for structure, quantity, and quality. But I thought I heard one of these presentations at some point that your main 2.5 for your first, but your second, as long as it was under a certain amount of square footage, you were allowed with less water. Was it a half a gallon? Tell me.
That is correct. I think in details, it's spelled out in our well ordinance. And it's, when we look at a typical development, we're looking at the first home on a parcel, right? Most of these already have at least one on. And then the subsequent, as long as they are below a certain square footage, then they come in at simply adding an increment to that 2.5 gallons. It's not 2.5 gallons a minute per. Now, as you remember the presentation I gave
Great, thank you.
a couple of years ago, and that talked about, okay, we have 1 to 4 service connections. When we hit 5, now that becomes currently a regulated, not a public water system. 5 to 14 service connections for water is called a state small water system, which is a complete misnomer. It's because the state jammed it in as a regulation, as a level that the federal government doesn't have. Federal government takes 15 service connections and more, and then a population and above. So California has that 5 to 14 service connections. We regulate that through environmental health. Only the health officer can regulate that, not the state. And then what we've talked about is that, what do we do where it's 1 to 4 service connections that include any element of farm worker housing? But you're right. Once we hit the 5 service connections, now we don't just look at the 2.5 gallons a minute in increment. That feeds into it, but we do a full water balance and look at the population served. It gets more in depth when we start looking at that as a state small.
I get it. I guess, if we know that 2.5 for the first, and I thought it was like a half a gallon for the others, if there's a certain square footage, and if there was a tiny home manufactured builder that had the state certification, inspection, whatever the requirements are, there might be something there that.
Correct. It really would, I mean, we're looking at for septic treating the farm worker housing of 1 and 2 bedroom units, like an ADU. And we already have that written into our septic ordinance. It's just a matter of defining it better for farm worker housing. Same kind of thing could come into play on the water situation.
Thank you.
So, Peter, I know you have a question. I forgot, I didn't answer James' original question, which is the number of violations. I don't have them spread out between the 5+ or 1 to 4, but your overall statement is accurate. Those who were inspected annually had fewer overall things than those who were just discovering for the first time and identifying those, I don't have exact stats, but.
Well, but I do want to qualify that though, because when we do the annual inspection, for those of you who have farm worker housing that's permitted, we go over the farm worker housing a lot more thoroughly. We go in and we start, I mean, we're looking at GFCIs, right? And so we're doing a lot more thorough inspections. So I wouldn't assume that the inspection violations are fewer because we're looking at, we've got a much longer punch list than we have for the life and safety for the.
That's totally fair. I think, so we don't have the exact stats for exactly how they play out, but in general, that's why the ones who are inspected annually, I think are generally going to be of a, certainly of a habitability standard higher, although they're inspected for more. And that's actually really bad.
Well, say, I always knew that it was 50 square feet per person, but in our annual inspection of years ago, it used to be Brian Friends, and he used to come out and after inspection months later, we had his audit with the state. He asked if he could bring the state inspector to our campus and find. State inspector explained it a little differently than what I always thought, 50 per square foot. How he explained it was that you're allowed 1 per bedroom, even if it's less than 50. It's the additional each 50 is a per person. And I never heard it that way before.
So like the first bedroom, you can have less, but.
Say if the first bedroom is less than square.
Right, the 50.
You have 1 person, but say if you have a bedroom that is say 75 square foot, you have 1 and the next additional 50 feet is another one.
Mhm.
And so, and I never heard it that way, but I heard it directly from the state inspector.
Interesting.
And he said, Peter, I want to explain. And I told him, I never heard it that way. So in other words, if there's some bedrooms that are say 48, 45 square feet, you can have your 1. But if there's some bedrooms that are say 90 square feet, it's not 200, it's not 100, so it's not, you still have 2 because the first one is allowed less than square feet. It's the additional every 50. And I can see from the look of your face, and I never heard it that way as well. And I looked at it and he says, yes. So I just wanted to share it, but I heard it directly from the state. His audit, and I told him I never heard it that way before. I always heard it like you were saying,
Right.
1 per 50. And so I said, oh, so if you have 60 square feet, he says, have 2 because it's 1 and then every 50.
Yeah, so the first one gets 10 and then the second one
Yeah,
gets 50.
well, it's average.
Interesting.
But
Okay.
I never heard it that way, and I just wanted to share that, and that was directly from the state inspector.
Well,
And-
yeah, we'll definitely
I
make
do
sure
know,
before we
and I
start
do
looking
know
at that
some
again.
mobile homes are like, the bedrooms are like 48 square feet, so you
Right.
allowed 1 for the bedroom, and then every 50 square feet is your addition.
Right.
So, and like I said, unless he was repeat it to me.
Right.
So, and like I said, I always heard it like you said earlier, but I just want to share that.
I wanted to just, there's someone from RCD did want to speak. I want to see if they're still online. Oops, sorry. Wait a minute. Hi,
Hey
can you-
everyone, can you hear me?
Thank you.
Awesome. This is Eliza from RCD. I'm the Ag Ombudsman. Just wanted to chime in back when Steve was talking about if folks are thinking of building housing. I think one of the things that was obviously mentioned in the presentation by Justin is kind of talking about making the process a little bit more user friendly, but I also just wanted to remind everyone that if you are in the midst of permitting or looking to permit or wanting to build housing, that the Ag Ombudsman really is a resource and I can help do a lot of the sort of grunt work. I know that free time is not necessarily what everyone has in abundance. So just wanted to remind folks, because I think that can also feel like a burden, but also really important one. And just a reminder that that's a big part of this resource. So just wanted to call that out, and thanks for the presentation. It was cool to see the numbers. I guess one question I have is, you did kind of show a number of like unpermitted versus permitted structures. And I know that's really was not the focus, or maybe you didn't, but I know that was not the focus of the task force. And I was just wondering, yeah, like how, if you had any conversations with folks about bringing anything unpermitted up to code, and how you imagine that process taking place, if at all.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I don't think we reported permitted versus unpermitted because as you all know, in that last year with a lot of the operators, we identified that we would not be citing just because something is not permitted. Now, our ideal would of course be if everybody who has unpermitted housing gets that permitted, because that at least ensures at that point it's up to code, it's safe, it's up to all the standards. And part of the intent behind trying to streamline the process and provide more resources is hopefully to encourage folks to adopt that process in order to get all the housing up to the current standard. So that we would love to do that, and if there are things that we can do within our power to help facilitate that, we would be happy to consider those as well.
Eliza, was that everything?
Yep, that's all. Thanks.
And then one more. Let me see if Ed Diaz wanted to. Ed, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Did you still have your hand raised?
No, I didn't have my hand raised.
Okay, sorry. Okay, that's everything.
Okay, no worries.
Laura?
Yeah, can we get that CDX for farm labor housing implemented immediately, please?
Yeah, we could use your help with the coastal commission. I've got a meeting with them tomorrow and we're talking about that. Yeah, it would be huge. Just a note about this concept of an exemption. So there are exemptions provided by the Coastal Act, which are automatically folded into our LCP. There's like repair and maintenance type things. And then there's an exemption called a categorical exclusion. And these are jurisdiction specific. And it requires a supermajority vote of the Coastal Commission to allow a local jurisdiction to expand exemptions beyond what the Coastal Act provides. So it's a heavy lift, but one that we think is definitely worth pursuing. I think the point that Justin made in presenting that idea of we need to put some parameters around it to be successful, because if we ask for a blanket exemption, the answer I think is going to be no. But if we say an exemption provided that the farm worker housing is, outside of sensitive habitats, right? We know that's going to be a no-go, right? So we have to make that commitment that we're not going to apply an exemption to allow it to build in a sensitive habitat, right? So we're going to have to work on those parameters, and we're going to have to gain support of the state, and that's where you all can come in and help us with that, because I think they would like to approve it, but they need to have the justification and know that the local support.
I did have another question too. With the talk of tiny homes and aligning with ADU regulations, wondering if you looked at allowing ADUs in unincorporated.
We do allow ADUs in unincorporated, right? So the issue gets to, limits on density, right? So an ADU just for another family is contrary to our PAD, but an accessory unit for farm workers, we just call it farm worker housing. So I think there's merits behind ADUs for families and continuing generations of upcoming farmers. So I think that is something that we could support moving forward, but at this point, we're really prioritizing on farm worker units.
I had another three things. Since we're talking about tiny homes again, one thing that kind of has come up a lot when you guys have been talking about tiny homes is this idea that there's going to be multiple people in it. But for us, we have farm labor, a bunch of farm labor housing. And we have a whole section of farm labor housing that is just for single guys. And when we looked into getting tiny homes, it was specifically for people that were single that would not be bringing in a family to live there. So I just wanted to tell you guys that for us, the purpose isn't necessarily for a family to be living in there. It's for a single person. The next is going to the farm labor housing like loan programs. I know that we've looked at them in the past, we've used them in the past, and I know the last time we attempted to, the reason we didn't really move forward with it was because it's not enough. And it wasn't effective for us because the hurdles are too high now to get in farm labor housing. And for a program like that to work for us, it needs to be much higher so that we can get over all the permit hurdles for septic, for water, for all those things, because it's now quite costly.
So do you have anything, I appreciate that comment. Do you have anything specific in terms of which parts of it were not workable? If I recall, it was 20% from the owner, 80% was going to be the loan that was forgivable after
It
20
was
years.
just the amount. It had a max limit of X dollars, and it's just not enough to get through the permitting process. Especially when you get to like engineering documents and stuff like that.
So it wasn't the permits themselves, it was the cost to have the engineering documents.
Yeah,
plans
and all
developed,
the equipment that's gonna go
designs.
into it. I mean, the costs are just astronomical now to bring in anything, especially like when we're talking about larger residents and larger amounts of people. The drawings are very expensive. And then the next tying into that too was you were talking about septic. And I'd heard a while ago through the grapevine that there was potentially going to be loosening of regulations with septic, or if there's going to be any kind of help or additional ways that we could proceed in septic systems. Because I know last time I tried to expand our septic system, that was also quite hard, and being able to contact with the county was hard, and finding different solutions was hard. And so I'm hoping that septic systems and various sewage treatments will open up as well.
I'm always willing to hear more about your questions about what you're thinking about different septic alternatives. I mean, my staff and I are in touch with the septic designers, septic installers who do work in this area, as well as other agencies around the state and what they allow and what they don't allow. And looking at all of that within the lens of what the state does allow, because this is it's a program that we have to meet the state regulation and implement it. But I'm always willing to hear the questions and try to see what we can.
I mean, if you had an idea, because we've been hearing rumors, but we don't know the details. It's like we're chasing like ghost rumors and, you know, trying to understand what it is that you have your designer has looked at, or you have looked at, but don't believe that you can get through. If we know what those are, we can unpack those with you. And you know, if we see a barrier, we can understand what the barrier is with you. And if the barrier can be removed, we'll remove the barrier. But if there's a reason, we want to understand as much as you do what it is.
What the limitation.
Right, right.
Yeah,
So, and that goes for all of the septic system ideas. You know, we have not really been able to get to the heart of what some of these alternative ideas are. And, you know, we've heard a few things here and there, and we go run them down and we're hitting dead ends. And so what I really want to know, I think Greg and I and Ed is like, okay, so just tell us specifically so that we can understand what it is that you've thought about doing.
What your question or what your limitation is, or what idea you're trying to advance.
Right.
And how that could fit into our program.
Right, we've heard a lot of, oh, in this county you can do this, and everything we've heard of that would track down, you can do that in this county too. So I think some of it is, the specifics of exactly what is being proposed, and is it really that thing that would be legal in that county, or is it something else? And we would be happy to track that down and see. But we're very open to that, understanding the limitations, physical and legal, around septic systems on our side.
Yeah, I have a few comments. On echo what James said, not that it pertains to me, but some farm worker, rather than living in a barracks, a lot of them would rather live in a tiny home, single person, because they have their own space. And the other thing too, here months ago was a presentation across meets that was there, that they were exploring above ground septic systems where it's not necessarily in this county, but in other counties they are. And I didn't quite understand what that meant, so I went home and Googled it. And I found out it's basically bringing dirt.
Mound system.
It's a bound system,
Yes, yes.
which is actually more expensive to do than a trench based system.
And the other thing too, the last thing too, I heard of years ago, and you can correct me on this here, that because there wasn't a lot of space in the wood side, instead of having their typical pipe and trench, they drill the 36-inch diameter holes and have it going like a well, but going down.
You're probably thinking 40 to, well, I'll say 50 years ago. That specifically is banned by the state. Yeah.
On the topic of septic as well, in terms of above ground tanks, which I know that you mentioned in the presentation, there were some
So the most of the.
Sewage
violation-
holding
most
tanks.
Yeah, they're holding.
Holding
tanks,
tanks.
Yeah.
What, if from an environmental perspective, what would be the risk of having a holding tank and having it being pumped out? Because a lot of the farms, we have porta potties on site and we have companies coming up out regularly.
Right,
Is there, I wonder why there's a particular concern with that?
right.
It just seems to be, actually, in some respects, it's probably more environmentally friendly.
So I think that we would have to disagree. We would agree to disagree on that. I think the state is pretty set, and I would go as far to say is it's a national standard too, is that the waste needs to go and it needs to go underground. It needs to be distributed underground. So there are always exceptions to that. If, state parks have an exception, but we would not be allowed to write that into our ordinance, because our ordinance has to be approved by the state. The state, it's actually the Regional Water Quality Control Board. And if we were to write that in,
The state would approve it. Okay. Great.
no, it'd come right back to
Okay.
us. So, yeah, so the majority of the issues that we saw were the holding tanks, and they were next to all of the structures. And so what Greg and Ed are working with each of you to do, and if you need to wait until after this ordinance gets passed so you can put a smaller footprint in, then okay, but we need to get the waste underground. We need to get some leach fields in.
Sure.
Yeah.
Has there been any thought of reduction or elimination of permitting fees for farm labor housing?
Already waived.
They've been waived for
So
years.
since 1990, both
Thank
planning
you.
and building and environmental health as we interact, any one-time fees related to farm worker housing.
Construction
We're
fees,
waived.
permitting fees, but the ongoing fees for employee housing is not
And-
waived, but
right.
all of the construction,
Yeah, I
all
think
of
that's
those fees are
James'
waived.
point. I think, drawing, engineering,
That's what-
actually
That's where
getting
the
all your
cost is,
plans,
not necessarily
constructing, that's where.
the cost of a permit. Because we don't.
Yeah,
charge
that
for
step isn't
any one
waived.
time.
If I could do it, I would.
Yeah, I hear you saying that the holding tanks are definitely bad, and they're bad because the state would not allow us to do it, but you didn't say why they're bad.
So from an environmental perspective, I know that all of you maintain your holding tanks in good
Perfect
condition.
condition, right?
Yes, and none of you have your holding tanks next to creeks, nowhere near creeks. But I would say that more broadly, we see it happen regularly, and we see accidents happen when the tanks are pumped. And you end up with, with problems going in the creek and, or sewage on the ground. And all of those are public health and environmental issues. And so that's why, it's not, I'm sure it's not any of your tanks, and you've never had it happen to you, but That's why the rule is in place, statewide, and, I would venture to say it's also nationally, as a general rule, it's not allowed.
Great, thank you. There will be more meetings. You probably will attend. Some of you will probably have some of these other meetings, and so you may hear a repeat, but if you have other ideas or you could hear about other septic alternatives or something like that, feel free. There's the in the packet, there's the email addresses, but you can contact any one of us. If you don't have any of our contact information, we're happy to give to you after the meeting. And we'll go through this process in the next couple of months, and then after gathering all the input, then we hopefully will be able to implement some of these changes.
Peter, something real quick.
I just want to say thank you for all you did. Presentation.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Point, so I'll ask. For the next number, Ed and I we didn't prepare anything for you, but we were here to answer any questions that you had about environmental health that you deal with, whether it is anything septic, anything wells and water supply, the farm work, any of the employee housing related things, or anything else that we maybe could answer for you, cottage food industry, or you name it.
You guys are gonna open a restaurant.
Just got one question. These trailers that have been put in lately and you've inspected, you're talking about, we're talking basically farm laborers. What about the ones that are being used they're not farm workers. They're taking and using this to get cheap rent in somebody's place. And have the same problems that the farm labor house does. They don't have the square footage, they don't have the septic, they don't have the water, somebody don't have electricity. Is anything gonna be done about that?
Yeah, that would fall into our standard violation enforcement protocol. This task force has been focused on the employee housing. But yeah, if folks are aware of situations such as you're describing, we are definitely ready and willing to investigate.
And we have been.
And we, in fact,
Yeah.
at least two of the safety inspections that we did pivoted over into non-farm housing and code compliance issue.
I'm just curious, they're popping up, seem to be popping up.
I mean, most government enforcement systems, compliance systems are complaint based. And so that is typically how our code enforcement and those pieces work. Obviously, the task force created a special situation where we were more going door to door. That is not typically how compliance systems work. So I'm sure on the planning building website, you can find a number to report for complaints that anyway, if you know of any unhealthy or unsafe conditions, we would actually love to know about it because we would go out there and investigate.
Okay, so Ed and Greg just have a question period for us. If we have any other questions for you. Yeah. Hearing unpermitted septic is preferable to a holding tank.
I wouldn't go that far.
I mean, a do-it-yourself, a DIY septic.
You asked about the holding tanks, and number one, it is a state issue, but it's when you come to the sewage holding tanks. What we saw as some problems with the holding tanks, where caps were not replaced. Some of them where the caps were blown off because somebody overused and their sewage blew the cap off of the holding tank and sewage going to the ground. A lot of them cited where they shouldn't be cited. For that reason, as Heather was saying, I'm sure that you guys who have those, you don't have them near the creek or within the riparian corridor or too close to it, or other habitats or where kids are going to go playing in it when it does overflow. Because that's one of the biggest problems with the sewage holding tanks is you get a leaky toilet and it overflows, or whatever it may be.
We've also seen cars back into them and then the whole thing comes down, right? And
Yeah.
so you know, in the ideal state, when, you know, when it's just yours at your, you know, and you're just focusing on your own home, you can make sure that nothing happens, but we get to see everything like high level and,
I don't want to say unpermitted, but a septic system is perfect. This is, you know, a lot of people think, oh, a septic system's bad, you know, sanitary sewer, public sewer, good. In your area, septic systems are great. That's what they're meant for.
and, you know, to put the public health hat on it, and you have to point home, not that you guys need that, but, you know, treating the waste, putting it underground is what has improved the human lifespan as much as the single biggest improvement for human lifespan. And so, you know, having sewage sitting on top and tanks with the risks of having surfacing sewage gives, you know, it makes my heart
I
palpitate.
mean, let's put it this way. Within the past 10 years, I've still come across properties that had outhouses and hit prisons that they had done, that they were using. That's not what we're talking about, putting the waste underground. But done properly, proper separation, vertical separation from groundwater, so we're not impacting groundwater, and meeting setbacks that are public health setbacks, from creeks, from wells, you name it, and other things that, you know, other setbacks where we just don't want to see the septic system damaged. It's important. But the sewage holding tanks, they are definitely not a long or medium term solution.
Greg, what about alternatives like composting toilets and incineration systems?
It's funny, I gave a presentation, I think Steve was there when we were out on, this was probably about 15 years ago, out on Tanitas Creek Road. Yeah, and they've gotten better. There is one county in California that does allow composting toilets for, they allow composting toilets in lieu of a septic system. It's one county. It's a very rural county. And their program for what you do with that compost, with the sludge, is very rigorous. And it's actually, if you average it over 10 years, 8 to 10 years, it's more expensive than putting a septic system in. But we're not, you know,
I think it's because they don't have the ability to put it these.
and it's because they
of the
can't.
soils.
Yeah, usually it's because they have something built on granite.
Granite.
There is no soil.
Where does the county stand in terms of like gray water systems? And I ask that because even a well-designed septic system, if it's in heavy soil or in a place with high groundwater, they're not always able to manage all the water that.
And that is why we size the septic system based on the actual measured percolation rate.
Right, so even, let's just say best case scenario, sometimes those systems don't work.
So we don't give a discount on distribution area if you have a gray water system installed. Gray water systems, great. You can do that. It's in the plumbing code. It's chapter 15 or chapter 16 now of the plumbing code. They keep flip-flopping back since I think 17.
You can divert.
You can divert, but even when you install a gray water system, by the plumbing code, you have to be able to divert it back to your septic system or the sewer, depending on where you are. When it's raining out, you don't need that gray water. There's no way to distribute it that is proper. So in the winter, no gray water system. So you need to be able to divert that into your septic system. That's why we don't give a discount on distribution.
At the same time when you're.
At the same time when the system is gonna
Exactly,
fail, yeah.
exactly.
Asking for, right,
Yeah.
Any more?
One quick question. Your mounded systems, which we heard about, but that's not good, it's mounted, and that's only in the event because your water table's too high.
Correct. Correct. one of the setbacks is a vertical setback, a setback from the base of your distribution to the seasonal high groundwater. Now, if we allow septic systems with trench-based systems as shallow as a 2-foot deep trench with 1 foot of soil, which if you're looking at them, and that's gravity flow. If you're looking at a mound system, you have to pump the effluent. First, it's going to have to go to the septic tank first for clarification, for some treatment. Then you're going to have to pump it. And anytime you start pumping, that's going to cost you money. The design is more. It's you don't put it on the ground surface, but you have to go in because you have to distribute in native soil, not in fill. But then you can mound up. But that takes pumping, monitoring. It's more expensive to install and it's more expensive to maintain.
It takes power.
Exactly.
But if that's
Gravity
your
is
only
good.
option,
Yeah,
if that's
gravity
your
is
only
good.
option, then
Right.
absolutely, do
Yeah.
it. Or if you want to pay more money because you like the look.
That's the
Then-
last resort right there.
Yeah, do it. Oppose it.
Just want to say, Greg, don't retire soon.
Thank you.
That wasn't a question, you don't have to answer.
I'm not saying a word.
So I actually wanted to bring up, because environmental is here, I think probably a couple months ago, the committee members had discussed some questions which I had given off to Ed Diaz, and then since Greg and Ed are both, or are still here. I didn't know if you folks still have questions, and I'll go through them. There were 4 questions. One of them was, if you had further questions on them, because I think I had sent off responses from environmental health about cases of domestic wells illegally pulling from the creek. Does environmental health investigate if it's suspected that, actually those are tied together, if those are, how those are looked at, and then the process for reporting a violator, and then can county take more responsibility and be more cautious about proving domestic wells? So I didn't know on those topics if the members have further questions on those, again, since environmental health is here now.
I mean, I can give you guys a quick answer. It's a water rights issue when you're looking at if a well is pulling from a creek. And that's part of what the water master spoke to you about, a guy from Stetson Engineering. It's, that's where you're looking along the San Gregorio Creek watershed, San Gregorio Creek, Lahonda Creek, Alpine, other tributaries. If you are too close to the creek, but it's balanced by a water rights issue of you have the right to pull groundwater from your own property. So that's a California look at water rights. The Stetson Engineering, the whole water master issue for San Gregorio talks about or underground streams and not pulling from the underground streams. And that's really more of a vertical look within the stream bed. And so if you have a well, typically if you have a well that is legally constructed with at least a 20-foot sanitary seal, then you're pulling groundwater, you're not pulling surface water. The state, when they look at it, may classify that if they're looking at it as a well for a public water system. They may say, well, yes, it's groundwater, but it is under the direct influence of surface water. Not the same thing as pulling from the creek. There's been a lot of legal decisions around that groundwater surface water interaction. And a lot of that really does come to, again, groundwater rights versus could you be doing damage to the stream?
Yeah, the one time when it came across our committee and somebody was going to drill harvest in the creek, I asked the question at the county, what process does the county put forward of determining if it's from the creek or not? And so I called Alan, Stetson Engineer, and that's what he told me. That first of all, he said, "Funny, Peter, you asked that because the judge asked me the same question." And he said, and then he mentioned that are pulling from the creek, you do need water rights. So that's kind of like,
You would need declared rights of creek draw, of creek diversion.
that's right, that's how I explained it to you.
And when we look at it, we don't have a specific setback from a creek. A lot of that comes actually under planning and not doing anything within the riparian corridor. It is one of the things that we are considering as I rewrite the wells ordinance. Will we establish a setback from like center line or top bank of creek?
Well, one other thing too, Greg, I hear what you're saying, but that brings the other question in play is for the property owners that does have water rights. To me.
And you mean rights to withdraw from the creek?
That's right. For me,
Or in your case, from the lake conserve water?
well.
That's all different, right?
No, that's different. It's saying, it's just if a person has drive from the creek, if when you rewrite it, I would like to see it two ways, meaning the setback don't need to be as great is if you have water rights from the creek, simply because you legally can't go from it.
So that gets to be touchy because it's State Water Resources Control Board that does the whole water rights issue and creek diversion of water. In the specific case of San Gregorio Creek watershed, that's an engineering who was appointed as special master for that, all the allocations on that, for the adjudication of the rights to the creek. But in general, if you're pulling water from any creek, it's reportable. You have to report it and declare it to the State Water Resources Control.
I do know that there's the people that have water rights or have from the San Diego Creek and sold to other residents for using for potable water.
Yeah. Anything else I can take a wild stab at? I think most of you know how to get over it. So. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you all for being
I'll give you
here.
your meeting.
That leads us to item number 8, Planning and Building Department Director's Report.
Okay, so for the month of July, there were no PAD projects that were heard or considered by the Board of Supervisors or the Planning Commission. 2 for upcoming permits, PAD permits. There is 1 on Pescadero Creek Road. It's a coastal development permit, planned agricultural permit and grading permit. It's going to be for 2,300 approximately square foot single family residence. And the project planner is Sono Agrawal. And then there is for Coastside County Water District, they are doing a PAD plus coastal development permit and use permit to construct 4,200 feet of new pipeline from Upper San Vincent Reservoir to Denison Creek Pump Station. And this one is, I show it, I can look it up. This one is to be assigned, but I couldn't check that. I should go check it in the system now. For coastal development exemptions, there were none submitted for this period. The next meeting, AAC meeting is September 9th. And then a question was asked at the last meeting for an ag tourism project that had been submitted. and clarification on it, and that project is, I wanted to confirm that project is a renewal permit. And that is the end for the director's report.
Great. And then we have a lengthy number 9 with discussion items. I don't know if those are ones well, they're listed on the agenda, so we're free to discuss them. I'll go ahead and just start with A. We were hoping, I guess, to have a draft recommendation letter written by the AAC addressed to the county with regards to the Pescadero Fire Station mitigation measures. I don't.
Yeah, I
know
can
that
actually speak to that. For the ones that I think Natalie, because I think Natalie offered for a couple of these, Natalie offered to do drafts for these.
Yeah.
I did ask her for drafts. She wants to be present when we pass these along.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so we will defer that to September.
Yeah. Okay, great. And just to review, that was the committee hoping to stay abreast of how the fire station, the mitigation measures to compensate for the loss of farmland there, how those mitigation measures are actually going to be addressed going forward. I think there was a feeling in the committee that we might want to at least be able to weigh in as those deliberations take place. And I guess the second one, B, drafting steps and paths for the county to help preserve and promote farm labor housing. I think we've discussed some of that here as well. I know that Natalie Sarah's name is on there, so she has maybe been working on that. We can review that in a later meeting.
Yeah, we can continue to have that.
One committee member is present here, Daniel Theobald, had brought up the farm stays and wanting to discuss how when these are permittable, and is there any conflict with zoning regulations when you have farm stays for educational purposes?
Yeah, so a little background on this. When I first bought my property in San Gregorio, we had initiated a Airbnb program and did that for a few months, and it was actually quite, we were doing it along the lines of the state described farm stay program. At some point, and actually, we worked with the county to get a short-term rental permit and everything, and we're paying our fees. At some point, we were then told, based on a neighbor complaint, that Airbnb was doing, or the county was doing a experimental program with Airbnbs, but it wasn't allowed in PAD. It was only allowed in residential areas. And so we stopped it at that time. My hope is that it was such a positive program, both for the farm, income was amazing, and the ability to, sort of meet the educational goals of the state's farm stay program, I think is well aligned with a lot of what we talk about here. So I was wondering where that stands, if there's any opportunities to sort of create a farm stay program here in the county that isn't in conflict with the local regulations.
Yeah, I'd be happy to explore that and work with you. I don't have an answer for you on it today. I mean, the short-term rentals Airbnb is definitely restricted. The pilot program was in the residential areas of the coast. I think of farm stays as being more related to agritourism, ag education. And so I think there would be an opportunity for us to distinguish farm stays from your typical short-term rental program and explore how it could be allowed, provided, of course, the units are safe and there's adequate infrastructure, as some sort of conditional use permit.
It's fortunate that you happen to be here.
Yeah, it's not, yeah, I mean, explore that further. Go ahead, Jen.
My concern with you talking about that in terms of agritourism
Uh-huh.
is that when we're talking about agritourism, we talk about, you're only allowed a certain number of days per year and stuff like that. So that is one of my concerns. If we're gonna tie it to agritourism, is I'd like it to be a little more open.
Sure. And so for those of you who, most of you are familiar with our agritourism program, right? We have different levels, and what James is talking about is if you keep it within a certain parameter, a certain number of years, the pathway is a little bit easier. If you want to go more numbers of years, then the permitting requirements become a little bit more onerous. So it's not a, no, it can't happen. It's just likely going to trigger some permits. But yeah, how we thread the needle for different flavors of this idea is something that we can continue to discuss. I see the merits of it and would like to see what we could do to support moving forward.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of merits of it, and we don't have to talk about them here, but just the connecting the community with the source of their food, local production. I mean, all of these things are, to the benefit of everybody.
Right, and it would be, even though what you're doing is not a typical Airbnb, it probably would be very helpful to be able to partner with a platform like that to be able to get people to sign up, because they've already got it all set up beautifully.
Yeah, that shouldn't be like a red flag that it's not agritourism or something.
No, agreed.
But then you maybe don't want to give a blanket permission to any Airbnbs,
Well, I think, the reason I thought of ag tourism is because there's basic principles behind ag tourism where the use that's supplementing the agriculture doesn't become the primary use, right? And so I think that those are the sorts of parameters we want to look at, that farming and that agriculture is the primary business. Short-term stays are supplemental and in support of that, but a much smaller component. And so that's where, we have to strike the right balance, among other places.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I think part of the feeling was like, somebody in town can do this and get the additional income that it provides. And if we comply with the farm stay, the spirit of the farm stay, why would we be punished and not be able to do that?
All right. Discussion item D is also kind of headlined by Natalie. I think she was keen on, and hopefully people contacted her with some ideas, but wanting to list methods to help or strategies to help farmers stay in the area. She was working on having a draft, something that we would look at together to present to planning staff. Acknowledging like Cole brought up how some folks are not able, even though they'd like to farm in the area because of shortage of housing, make other decisions. And then it's something I brought up. I should have noticed that. I brought it up during the committee discussion, the reappoint or nominate an AAC representative to the Farm Worker Advisory Commission. And I guess I kind of I posed the question to Olivia, like, how long have I been on the committee? Like, do I get to stay on the Ag Advisory Committee? And because if I weren't going to continue, then it wouldn't make sense to serve in the role as on the Farm Worker Advisory Commission. I guess I'd be open to, if there is someone who's like, oh, I'd really like to serve on that commission. I'm happy to take those nominations.
John, is it an in-person or remote meeting or optional?
It's in person.
In person in Redwood City?
I think that there is an option to attend the meeting via Zoom, but not for the commission members. It is not in Redwood City. It's usually, well, it had been held every time in the Half Moon Bay Library, public library, but now I believe that they are making the intention to switch every other month. The meetings happen every other month, and every other meeting will be happening in Pescadero. to give, because many of the commission members are actually residents of Pescadero. And that way, it also gives folks from Pescadero a better opportunity to attend.
I was just thinking it'd be good if somebody wants to do it to know the logistics. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
for sure, yeah. Okay, well, we'll just kind of put that on the back burner. I'm trying to, yeah, I had trouble finding contact. I got emails from people from the commission
Mhm.
and then they got buried and I didn't respond to them. And so I just wanted to, but I'll maybe follow up with you, Olivia, this week. And I think we did it, even with so many great folks from the county coming out to spend time with us. And with that, I adjourn the meeting at 7:40 p.m.